Ceree in Cleve. We happen to be sitting in this beautiful Cummer gallery surrounded by beautiful art. What do you think the connection is between art and leadership in our community, and how does that involve Leadership Jacksonville?
In addition to it being a vehicle, a medium for capturing a place and time, it's more about, in my mind, about the diversity in our community. It takes a diverse thinking, diverse perceptions, diverse concepts, and they come out on canvas. Leadership Jacksonville is about that. It's about bringing diverse perceptions, attitudes, perspectives on our community together, and then leaving there motivated to address some of those things in ways that we probably wouldn't have addressed without having been introduced to those perspectives by way of Leadership Jacksonville.
To me, it reminds me of my background in economic development. One of the primary criteria business leaders use to choose what community they expand in is the quality of life. And in everybody's definition, art is a part of that definition of quality of life. And I think that's part of what we use to promote capital coming into Jacksonville was our quality of life, which is defined by all of the wonderful museums we have here with the Cummer, the performing arts that we have here, and the continually evolving art scene. I think the other thing that occurred to me was that there's a lot of studies done on high-performing students, and in almost every study that considers art and academic performance, they're connected. And those who have been exposed to arts tend to be those who are the most high-performing academically.
Leadership Jacksonville talks a lot about ethical communities and ethical leaders in our community. Is there someone that comes to mind when you think about ethics and ethical leadership in particular in our community?
Well, I have to say, although it's not in our community, my parents were my role models in ethics and community involvement, and that's where I learned how to be involved in a community. There are hundreds and hundreds of folks who have been involved in leading United Way and have the passion for our community and have been a role model and have showed that kind of leadership and ethical leadership that has made United Way successful. But it would be very difficult to name just one.
Ceree, what about you?
Well, I agree with Connie that there's a lot of examples of great leadership in the community. One comes to mind, Preston Haskell, who's exhibit here that we're sitting in, and Jim Winston and Bob Shercliffe and Fred Schultz, among many others. But for me, it's easy that it was my father who modeled community stewardship very early on. Unfortunately, he died a very young man about 35 years ago, but he left a legacy that suggested to me that I had an obligation to volunteer and put back in the community that's given and been blessed to all of us so greatly. And the ethics that he demonstrated is something I think about a lot.
When I think about that myself, like you, lots of people come to mind, you know, and so like being at the Academy Awards, you don't want to start naming names and you forget somebody, right? But I think for me, at the top of the list, if there is a list, would be the pastor of my church, the Reverend C.B. Daly, who taught me a lot about advocacy and towing the line in a steadfast faith. I grew up in the old Barnett Bank organization, and I learned a lot about being focused on service to the community. It was the culture in the organization. I grew up there, and that organization at the time was led by folk like Hugh Jones and Roland Kennedy and Albert Ernest. And then in my family, my grandmother was what you might describe as Pharisaic. You know, she was a rule maker. And she was adamant about you sticking to those rules. But I think without those rules, a knucklehead like me would just run wild. So between the organization and those people, and more particularly my grandmother and the church I grew up in, I think there are many role models to point to who provide for our community, and for me in particular, the kind of leadership, ethical leadership that's important to a community.
The icon for this event tonight is the Tilly Fowler Memorial, located right down the river in a park not very far from here. What does that have to do with about leadership?
Well, first of all, Tilly was such an icon in our community, and so many people loved her and respected her, and she was such a role model for leadership. It made me think when I read about the sculpture and what they were naming it, showing the way. That's exactly what Tilly did. She showed the way. And it also made me think about those are my two young sons. In transitions in their lives, they were giving little acorns, and the acorns would grow into great oak trees, and that was a sign when they were graduating from high school or college or even in preschool that they would grow into great oaks. And I like to think about Tilly Fowler being someone who distributed many acorns in this community that turned into great oak trees. Many leaders in this community are doing what they do and are exemplified by Tilly Fowler's leadership.
She clearly demonstrated great community leadership, and that's something. But in addition to be a fine person, she had a tremendous impact not only on our community, but had an impact on the U.S. and globally. She really was deeply felt by a lot of different people, or affected a lot of different people in deep ways.
You don't have a list if Tilly's name isn't on that list. One of my favorite quotes is, always have the courage not to accept someone else's courage. Tilly exemplified courage. So it's no wonder that we'd have a symbol that represents this event, that represents Tilly, and how Tilly represents the notion of courage, courageous leadership in a community. We could probably pick a lot of people, but we could pick none better than a Tilly Fowler.
Cleve, Connie, how would you like to be remembered?
I think it's someone who didn't care about being remembered, and if remembered, as someone who cared immensely about the community he lived in, much about family, much about self-improvement, much about our community's growth, the quality of life for our community, for all. If to be remembered at all. Being remembered is not an important issue for me. What's important is the work ethic in that community, and if that's worthy of remembering, then somebody else will label it such.
I think on a personal level, as you suggest, you want to be known as somebody who contributed through their children, somebody who made it a better place to live for your children and grandchildren, and on maybe a broader economic basis as a good community steward who did return to the community the blessings that were given to me.
That's a tough question. On a personal level, I would hope to be remembered by my two sons as a good mother and someone that instilled the values and the characteristics in them to make them have a good life and a productive life. On a community level, I would hope to be remembered with my many years in United Ways as someone who cared passionately about others and to improve the lives of children and families and to galvanize the leadership in our community to make a difference. And there's so many examples of that, and I just feel very fortunate to have been a part of a great movement.